Suffering in loneliness. The cold wind howled through the empty streets, carrying with it the eerie silence of despair. In a forgotten alley, hidden among piles of garbage, a weak shadow moved slowly. It was a German shepherd, his once glorious body now covered in dirt and wounds. His fur was matted, his ribs visible, and his skin crawled with millions of tiny parasites that fed on his flesh. Every movement was painful, but he kept going, driven by sheer survival instinct. This was no ordinary dog. His name was Rex, a former military service dog who had once served in the U.S. Army. He had saved lives, detected explosives, and stood bravely beside soldiers in war zones. But when he became too old and injured to serve, he was retired. His handler had promised to adopt him, but circumstances changed and Rex was left behind, abandoned in the streets like he never mattered. He didn't understand why. He had spent his life protecting humans, but now no one was there to protect him. Days turned into weeks and Rex's condition worsened. The parasites multiplied, digging deep into his skin, causing unbearable itching and pain. His legs trembled as he walked, searching for food in trash bins, but every step was exhausting. People walked past him without a second glance. Some wrinkled their noses in disgust, while others threw stones to chase him away. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, and his vision blurred from weakness. One evening, as Rex struggled to find shelter from the freezing cold, he collapsed near a deserted gas station. His breathing was shallow, his body barely moving. He had fought many battles, but this was one he was losing. His once powerful bark was now a faint whimper, lost in the wind. His tired eyes looked up at the sky as if asking, was this how it was all supposed to end? But fate had other plans. Just as Rex was about to close his eyes, a van pulled up nearby. The doors opened and footsteps approached. Someone gasped. "Oh my God, look at him," a voice said. A group of rescuers stood there, their faces filled with shock and concern. One of them, a woman with kind eyes, knelt beside Rex and gently placed a hand on his frail body. "We need to save him. Now." A race against time. The rescuers sprang into action. One of them, a man named Jake, carefully lifted Rex into his arms. The dog was so light that it felt like carrying only bones and fur. His body was burning with fever, and the parasites had spread everywhere, crawling over his face, ears, and legs. The stench of infection filled the air, but Jake didn't care. "Hang in there, buddy," he whispered as he carried Rex to the van. Inside the van, the team worked quickly. The woman with kind eyes, Dr. Emily, a veterinarian, checked Rex's pulse. It was weak. His breathing was slow. His body was shutting down. "He doesn't have much time," she said. She started an IV drip to give him fluids, while another rescuer, Sam, gently tried to clean some of the wounds. As soon as Sam touched Rex's fur, dozens of tiny parasites jumped onto his gloves. "Jesus, I've never seen this many parasites on a dog before," he muttered. The van sped towards the rescue center. Every second counted. Emily kept her hand on Rex's chest, making sure he was still breathing. The dog lay motionless, his once strong body now completely powerless. She remembered reading about military service dogs like him, how they fought alongside soldiers, saved lives, and never hesitated to protect their teams. And yet, here he was, left to suffer alone. Her heart ached. "You were a soldier, Rex," she whispered, "and soldiers don't give up." As they neared the rescue center, Rex's condition worsened. His breathing became even more shallow, and for a moment, his body stiffened. "No, no, no, stay with us, Rex," Emily cried. She placed an oxygen mask over his muzzle, hoping it would help. The van screeched to a stop in front of the clinic, and the team rushed Rex inside. They had saved many dogs before, but none were in such a terrible condition. Inside the clinic, Emily and her team prepared for an emergency treatment. Rex had a long fight ahead, but at least now he wasn't fighting alone. The battle to save his life had just begun. The fight for survival. The clinic was in full emergency mode. Dr. Emily and her team worked rapidly, knowing that every second was critical. Rex lay motionless on the treatment table, his breathing weak and irregular. His body was so frail that even a slight touch made him wince in pain. His fur, once thick and strong, was now covered in open wounds, dried blood, and millions of parasites that crawled over his skin like an army of invaders. Emily took a deep breath. "We need to remove these parasites immediately, or they'll kill him," she instructed. Sam, wearing thick gloves, carefully used a special medicated shampoo to soak Rex's fur. The moment the water touched his body, parasites began to detach, floating in the soapy liquid like tiny monsters. The team watched in horror. There were thousands of them. Some had burrowed deep into his skin, causing painful infections. Emily injected a parasite-killing solution, knowing it was the only way to get rid of them all. As the treatment continued, Rex's body twitched weakly. His mind drifted between consciousness and darkness. He wasn't just fighting the parasites. He was battling the memories of his past. Images flashed before his eyes. Military bases, explosions, the voice of his handler shouting commands, the warmth of a soldier's touch, the smell of gunpowder in the air. He had been trained to be fearless, to never back down. But now he was at his weakest. Suddenly Rex let out a painful whimper. Emily immediately checked his vitals. "His heartbeat is irregular. We might be losing him," she said in alarm. She quickly prepared an injection to stabilize him. "Come on, Rex, you didn't give up in war. Don't give up now." The team held their breath as the medicine entered his veins. His body jerked slightly, and for a few seconds there was silence. Then, a weak but steady breath. Relief washed over the team, but they knew this was only the beginning. Rex had survived the first step, but he was still dangerously weak. His wounds needed deep cleaning, and his malnourished body required careful feeding. His fight for survival was far from over. Between life and death, Rex lay on the treatment table, his body trembling as his weak heartbeat struggled to keep him alive. The parasites were finally dying, their grip on his flesh weakening after the medicated wash, but the damage they had done was severe. His skin was raw, covered in deep wounds and scars from the relentless infestation. His eyes, once filled with the sharp alertness of a military dog, now looked distant, as if his soul had already started drifting away. Dr. Emily, watching his condition closely, knew that this was the most critical stage. She had treated many abused and abandoned animals before, but Rex's case was different. He wasn't just a stray, he was a forgotten hero, a warrior discarded by the very people he had served. And now, he lay here, barely clinging to life, his body exhausted, his willpower fading. The team worked in complete coordination, knowing that even the slightest mistake could cost Rex his life. Sam prepared a set of painkillers and antibiotics, carefully injecting them into Rex's system to ease his suffering and stop further infection. Meanwhile, Emily monitored his hydration levels, adjusting the IV drip to ensure his body was receiving enough fluids. His stomach had shrunk due to prolonged starvation, making it impossible to feed him solid food immediately. Instead, they started with a liquid nutrient solution, gently feeding him small amounts through a syringe. The first few drops touched his tongue, and for a moment, there was no reaction. But then a weak swallowing reflex kicked in, a tiny sign of hope. Emily glanced at her team. "He wants to live," she whispered, gripping the syringe tighter. "He's still fighting." But the battle was far from over. As the night progressed, Rex's body began showing signs of severe trauma. His breathing became uneven, his legs twitching as if he were trapped in a nightmare. His mind was stuck in the past, reliving the terrifying moments of war, the deafening gunfire, the smell of burning metal, the urgent commands of his handler. He had once been a fearless soldier, leading his team through danger, sniffing out threats before they could strike. But now, in his weakened state, he was defenseless. The clinic's safe walls must have felt like a prison, his fragile state a betrayal of the strength he once had. Emily noticed his distressed movements and gently placed a hand on his head. "You're not alone anymore, Rex," she whispered. "You're safe now." Her voice, soft yet firm, seemed to reach him. His breathing steadied slightly, and his body stopped trembling. For now. As dawn approached, exhaustion weighed heavily on the team. They had spent hours stabilizing Rex, but the real challenge was just beginning. The infections in his wounds were deep, and some of them showed signs of necrosis. His weakened immune system made it difficult for his body to fight back. Emily sighed, rubbing her forehead. If they didn't act fast, Rex could still lose the battle. She knew what needed to be done: a complex surgical cleaning process to remove the dead tissue, an aggressive antibiotic treatment, and a long, slow recovery ahead. But would his body be strong enough to handle it? Would his spirit allow him to keep fighting? Outside the clinic, the first rays of sunlight touched the horizon, signaling a new day. But inside, time felt frozen. The team gathered around Rex. The team worked in complete coordination, knowing that even the slightest mistake could cost Rex his life. Sam prepared a set of painkillers and antibiotics, carefully injecting them into Rex's system to ease his suffering and stop further infection. Meanwhile, Emily monitored his hydration levels, adjusting the IV drip to ensure his body was receiving enough fluids. His stomach had shrunk due to prolonged starvation, making it impossible to feed him solid food immediately. Instead, they started with a liquid nutrient solution, gently feeding him small amounts through a syringe. The first few drops touched his tongue, and for a moment, there was no reaction. But then, a weak swallowing reflex kicked in, a tiny sign of hope. Emily glanced at her team. "He wants to live," she whispered, gripping the syringe tighter. "He's still fighting." But the battle was far from over. As the night progressed, Rex's body began showing signs of severe trauma. His breathing became uneven, his legs twitching as if he were trapped in a nightmare. His mind was stuck in the past, reliving the terrifying moments of war, the deafening gunfire, the smell of burning metal, the urgent commands of his handler. He had once been a fearless soldier, leading his team through danger, sniffing out threats before they could strike. But now, in his weakened state, he was defenseless. The clinic's safe walls must have felt like a prison, his fragile state a betrayal of the strength he once had. Emily noticed his distressed movements and gently placed a hand on his head. "You're not alone anymore, Rex," she whispered. "You're safe now." Her voice, soft yet firm, seemed to reach him. His breathing steadied slightly, and his body stopped trembling. For now. As dawn approached, exhaustion weighed heavily on the team. They had spent hours stabilizing Rex, but the real challenge was just beginning. The infections in his wounds were deep, and some of them showed signs of necrosis. His weakened immune system made it difficult for his body to fight back. Emily sighed, rubbing her forehead. If they didn't act fast, Rex could still lose the battle. She knew what needed to be done: a complex surgical cleaning process to remove the dead tissue, an aggressive antibiotic treatment, and a long, slow recovery ahead. But would his body be strong enough to handle it? Would his spirit allow him to keep fighting? Outside the clinic, the first rays of sunlight touched the horizon, signaling a new day. But inside, time felt frozen. The team gathered around Rex, knowing that today could be the turning point. Either he would regain his strength and start the road to recovery, or his body would give up under the weight of his suffering. Emily took a deep breath and made her decision. "We start the surgery in an hour," she said firmly. "If we wait any longer, it might be too late." The team nodded in agreement, preparing themselves for the biggest challenge yet: bringing a fallen soldier back to life. Soldiers' will to live. The clinic was silent except for the beeping machines monitoring Rex's weak heartbeat. The team had barely rested, knowing that time was against them. Dr. Emily stood beside the operating table, her hands steady despite the exhaustion. "We need to remove the infected tissue now," she instructed, her voice calm but firm. Rex was sedated, his body limp, but every so often a faint twitch of his paws showed that his subconscious mind was still trapped in the past. War never truly leaves a soldier. As the scalpel touched Rex's body, Emily worked with precision, cutting away the dead, infected flesh. Each incision was a battle against decay, against the slow death that had been creeping through his body for weeks. Sam assisted her, wiping away the blood and disinfecting the wounds as they worked. The parasites had done more damage than they had initially thought: deep sores, muscle weakness, and a dangerously compromised immune system. Every slice of infected flesh removed was a step toward his survival. Yet every cut reminded them of how much he had suffered. How could anyone abandon a hero like this? Emily clenched her jaw, forcing herself to focus. Rex didn't need anger. He needed healing. As the surgery continued, Rex's breathing became more stable, a sign that his body was responding. He was fighting. Even in the deepest state of unconsciousness, his will to live had not faded. Emily could almost picture him in his prime, standing tall, strong, his ears perked up as he waited for his handler's command. Military dogs like him were trained to be unbreakable, but even the strongest warriors had limits. Had he been left behind after an injury? Did his handler abandon him, or was it something worse? The questions burned in her mind, but she pushed them aside. First, they had to save him. The past could wait. After nearly 3 hours, the surgery was finally over. The infected flesh was removed, the wounds were cleaned and stitched, and the treatment for internal infections had begun. The hardest part was done, but his recovery was far from guaranteed. Emily gently stroked his head, her fingers brushing against the scars that lined his face. "You made it through, soldier," she whispered. "Now you just have to wake up." The team watched him carefully, knowing that the next 24 hours would decide everything. If he woke up and showed signs of strength, there was hope. If he didn't, they had done all they could. The team took shifts, staying by his side, monitoring his vitals, whispering words of encouragement as if he could hear them. The clinic, usually filled with noise and movement, was now quiet, waiting. Rex's chest rose and fell steadily, but his eyes remained closed. The battle wasn't over yet. He had survived the surgery, but now the hardest part began, finding the strength to open his eyes and fight for his life. The first signs of hope. The night passed slowly. The clinic bathed in dim light as the team remained on high alert. Rex lay motionless, his body wrapped in bandages, his wounds carefully stitched. A soft hum from the medical machines filled the room, monitoring his fragile heartbeat. Emily sat beside him, exhaustion evident in her eyes, but she refused to leave. She had seen too many animals give up after suffering like this, but something about Rex was different. Even in his weakest state, he had fought through the pain, as if some deep instinct refused to let go. As dawn broke, the first sign of change appeared, a slight twitch in his paw. Sam noticed it first, his breath hitching as he leaned in. "Emily," he whispered urgently, pointing to Rex's legs. Emily's tired eyes widened as she saw the faintest movement. It wasn't just a reflex, he was trying to wake up. She quickly adjusted his IV, checking his vitals. "Come on, Rex," she whispered, placing a gentle hand on his head. "You've come this far. Open your eyes." Minutes felt like hours as they waited, their eyes fixed on the German shepherd who had survived against all odds. Then, finally, a flicker of movement beneath his eyelids. A deep, shaky breath escaped his muzzle, and slowly, painfully, his eyes cracked open. Golden brown eyes, dull yet filled with something unbreakable, stared back at them. For a moment there was only silence, then a weak, barely audible whimper. Emily felt something tighten in her chest. He was in pain, but he was alive. Tears burned in the corners of Sam's eyes as he carefully placed a small bowl of water near Rex's mouth. At first, there was no response. Then, with slow, deliberate effort, Rex's tongue flicked out, lapping at the water weakly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "He's back," she murmured. "He's really back." The clinic staff, who had been waiting anxiously outside, let out small cheers of relief. But Emily knew better than to celebrate too soon. Waking up was only the first step. The real challenge, rebuilding his strength, healing his body, and perhaps even healing his spirit, was just beginning. Would he trust humans again? Could he ever be the soldier he once was? No one knew the answer, but one thing was certain. Rex had survived the impossible, and now, his second chance at life had begun. Learning to trust again. Rex's golden eyes scanned the room, unfocused and wary. He was awake, but confusion clouded his gaze. His body, though weak, still held the instincts of a soldier, ready to react, ready to fight. But there was no battlefield here, no gunfire, no handler giving orders. Only the soft voices of strangers, their hands reaching out, not to command him, but to comfort him. For the first time in his life, Rex was in a world where he didn't have to be a warrior. Emily watched his every move, careful not to startle him. She had seen animals wake up from trauma before. Some became aggressive, lashing out in fear, while others shut down completely, withdrawing from the world. What would Rex do? She knelt beside him, her hands open, palms up, a gesture of peace. "Hey, buddy," she whispered softly. "You're safe now." His ears twitched, registering the sound, but he didn't move. He didn't trust her. Not yet. Sam took a step forward, holding a small bowl of soft food mixed with medicine. The scent filled the air, tempting yet unfamiliar. Rex sniffed weakly, but made no attempt to eat. His body needed the food, but his mind was still trapped in survival mode. Had he been abandoned without food for days? Weeks? Was he waiting for someone, his handler, his team, to return for him? The thought made Emily's heart ache. She reached out slowly, placing the bowl near his mouth. "It's okay, Rex," she murmured. "You don't have to be afraid." For several long moments, Rex remained still. Then, with a hesitant movement, he licked at the food. One bite, then another. It was a small victory, but to Emily, it meant everything. It meant that somewhere deep inside, past the pain, past the betrayal, there was still hope. He wasn't giving up. He was willing to try. And that was enough. As the hours passed, Rex continued to eat in small, careful bites. His body was weak, his muscles stiff. But the worst was over. Now came the hardest part. Teaching a dog who had only known war and suffering that the world could be kind, that not all humans would abandon him, that he was more than just a forgotten soldier. He was a survivor, and Emily was determined to show him that his fight was over. From now on, he would never be alone again. The shadows of the past. The following days were filled with cautious progress. Rex's wounds were healing, his strength slowly returning, but his mind remained a battlefield. Every small sound, a door creaking, footsteps approaching, made his ears twitch, his body stiffen. He wasn't just recovering from sickness, he was recovering from something deeper, something that no medicine could heal. Emily watched him closely, studying the way he moved. His training was still there, buried beneath exhaustion. When Sam accidentally dropped a clipboard, Rex's reaction was instant. His ears perked, his body tensed, his eyes scanned the room, ready for a command that would never come. Even in weakness, he was a soldier first. Emily's heart ached at the sight. Had he spent his whole life waiting for orders, never knowing what it meant to simply exist? One evening, as she sat by his side, she took a risk. She reached out and gently ran her fingers along his back, where old scars marked his body. Rex flinched at first, his muscles tightening. But then, something changed. He didn't pull away. He let her touch him, let her presence sink in. It was the first time he had accepted comfort without fear. "You're safe now, Rex," she whispered. "No more battles, no more orders, just rest." That night, Rex slept peacefully for the first time since arriving at the clinic. No sudden jerks, no whimpers of distress, just the steady rise and fall of his breathing. Emily watched him, knowing this was just the beginning. The physical wounds would heal, but the scars on his soul would take longer. Would he ever trust humans fully again? Would he ever find the peace he deserved? She didn't have the answers, but one thing was certain: she wouldn't give up on him. Outside, the world moved on, unaware of the battle this one dog had fought. But in that quiet room, as Rex slept beside her, Emily knew he had taken his first real step toward freedom. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a survivor. And maybe, just maybe, he could learn to be something more. A bond beyond words. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, Rex started to change. His body grew stronger, his coat regained its shine, and his once dull eyes now held a faint spark of life. But it wasn't just his physical recovery that gave Emily hope. It was the little things. The way his ears perked up when she entered the room. The way he no longer flinched at sudden movements, and most importantly, the way he started seeking her presence. It was subtle at first. A glance, a shift closer. But Emily noticed. Rex was learning to trust again. One afternoon, she decided to test that trust. With a leash in hand, she knelt beside him. "Let's go outside," she said softly, her voice careful, reassuring. For a moment, Rex hesitated. The last time he had been on a leash, he had been a soldier, a tool for war. But Emily's touch was different, gentle, encouraging. Slowly, he allowed her to clip the leash to his collar, and together they stepped out into the world. The fresh air hit him first, carrying scents of grass, earth, and distant voices. No gunpowder, no commands, just life. Rex lifted his head, his nose twitching as he took it all in. Emily led him forward, not pulling, not pushing, just walking beside him. At first his steps were cautious, his body tense. But then, as they moved along the quiet path, something remarkable happened. Rex let out a deep breath, his body relaxing, as if realizing for the first time that he was free. As they reached a small clearing, Emily sat down on the grass, letting Rex decide what to do. He stood there for a moment, looking at her. Then, without hesitation, he lay down beside her. It was the first time he had willingly sought comfort, the first time he had chosen to be close without fear. Emily felt her throat tighten, overwhelmed by the moment. This wasn't just progress. This was a breakthrough. She reached out and gently ran her fingers through his fur. "You're doing great, Rex," she whispered. And for the first time since she had found him, Rex did something he had never done before. He leaned into her touch. No fear, no hesitation, just trust. For the world, Rex was just a rescued dog. But for Emily, he was a miracle. A new beginning. Rex's transformation was nothing short of a miracle. The once broken and abandoned soldier was now standing tall, his body strong, his eyes brighter than ever before. He no longer flinched at every sound, no longer searched for orders that would never come. He had finally accepted that his old life was behind him. But the question remained: what would his new life look like? Emily knew that Rex couldn't stay at the clinic forever. He deserved more than just survival. He deserved a home. But finding the right place wouldn't be easy. Rex wasn't just any dog. He had lived through battles, seen the worst of humanity, and carried scars, both visible and hidden. He needed someone who wouldn't just love him, but understand him. Someone who would never let him feel abandoned again. One afternoon, as Emily sat beside Rex in the clinic's garden, she spoke softly. "What if I told you that you don't have to leave?" she asked, watching his golden eyes for a reaction. He tilted his head slightly, listening. "What if I told you you could stay with me?" The words felt right. Emily had spent weeks trying to find Rex a home, only to realize that he had already found one. With her. Rex blinked, as if processing her words. Then, without hesitation, he moved closer, resting his head on her lap. Emily felt her chest tighten with emotion. He understood. And he had made his choice. She wrapped her arms around him, feeling the warmth of his body, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "Welcome home, Rex," she whispered. From that moment on, Rex was no longer a lost soldier. He was family. His past would always be a part of him, but it wouldn't define him anymore. He had survived the cruelty of abandonment, the pain of betrayal, and the loneliness of war. Now, he had love. He had a home. And most importantly, he had a future. Conclusion. Rex's journey was not just about survival, it was about second chances. His story proved that even the most broken souls could heal with patience, kindness, and love. Message to readers, our viewers. Every abandoned animal has a story. Some are left to suffer, but others, like Rex, get a second chance. If you ever find an animal in need, remember that a little kindness can change a life. Be the person who gives them hope.